ready then? Okay, good. So I kind of changed the title of this a little bit because I originally had set this up for a photography club up in Superior, and it was pretty technical. And I go, well, I don't think this group would be kind of leaning in that direction. It'd be more about the environment or the ecology of an area or something like that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to change this a little bit. So I changed the title to The Hidden Life of Cities. You know, when I was working for the National Park Service, we'd often run bio blitzes at various places. And if you're not familiar with a bio blitz would be, you know, we invite experts in from universities and various agencies, federal and state agencies, to identify all the species that we could in a 24-hour period in a given area. And even here in the city, like down along the Mississippi River where our park ran, it wasn't unusual to come up with 800, 900 different species. There's a lot of stuff out there, even in a city, in 24 hours, yeah. And we'd have, you know, maybe a crew of 50 experts there, something like that, 35 to 50. It includes fungi, it includes bugs, yeah, all that stuff. And so, so there's a lot of stuff out there that we can photograph. I have in my catalog, and these are just the photographs that I've kept. I've got about 128,000 photographs, and probably about a third of those I took in my backyard and in my patch. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. So one of the topics I want to talk a little bit about here is conservation photography. This is actually a thing. You know, if you think about the history of the National Park Service, you know, Yellowstone, the Hayden expedition went out there. Nobody really knew what was out there. Coulter came back with these fabulous stories of boiling mud pots and shooting hot water, and everybody was going, yeah, probably not, you know. But they sent, usually on those sorts of expeditions, they'd send a painter out and they'd paint the scenes and stuff like that. Well, on this particular expedition, they also sent a photographer. And of course, the camera equipment was, by modern standards, pretty crude, you know. They had really slow shutter speeds. Usually they just used a hat in front of the camera and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's probably the right exposure. They used glass plates. They had portable dark rooms that they carried in on mules, and it was a tough thing to do. But the photographs really kind of sold Congress on that this was really a special place. So photography in the national park system has always been very, very intertwined. And so we can turn that to be conservation photography. The nice thing about conservation photography is that you can use it to document species. It shows environmental changes over time. And certainly in my patch, I've seen a lot of changes over time. It can raise awareness of those natural resources. And it can inspire action as well, as it did with the national park system. So conservation photography can inspire people to take action to protect species, habitats, and communities, both human communities as well as natural communities. So let's talk about what a patch is, finding a patch. What's a patch? You know, it's something that you've got easy access to. My house backs up to Villa Park. I can walk out my back door and right down into Villa. That's a great patch. I like the variety of habitats that are available in places like Villa and Reservoir Woods. You know, the more different types of habitats and environments that you have within that area, and the more they grade into each other, probably the more species of wildlife you're going to have. And I'm kind of a wildlife guy. I do flower photography and stuff like that as well, but I really like the wildlife. And then, of course, for a photographer, it's helpful to have wildlife that will actually hang around you and they don't run away. You can do this in many places, but certainly if you want to create the really artistic photographs, it's nice to have animals that aren't looking over their shoulder at you as they run off. So here's my patch. And I kind of, you know, move around this patch quite a bit. So you can see that arrow, that's my house right there. And Villa Park is up to the northeast, and Reservoir Woods is off to the south and to the west. And then there's Tamarack Park down there too. Altogether, it's, you know, somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 300 acres or so, maybe a little bit less than that. Um, but it's just really handy for me, and so it makes a really good patch. And it's got that wide variety of habitat that I'm looking for, and a lot of wildlife. The neat thing about it is my house sits right between Reservoir Woods and Villa Park, and so everything runs back and forth through my yard. Yes.
You know, that, that was undeveloped. All of the parks in that one clump.
I don't. No. No. Um, I mean, part of Villa is too steep, probably to build on. I don't know. I mean, you can engineer anything that you want. You can stick a house on the side of a cliff, but yeah, in the reservoir. Yeah. Yep. Still kind of there. Yep. You can still see remnants of it. So at any rate, I get a lot of wildlife traffic through my backyard as they move back and forth between these different areas. And of course, we're going to be mostly used to the large animals because that's what we see. So things like the deer and the coyotes. I'm kind of like a deer and a coyote. One of the interesting things about these larger mammals is that Villa Park on its own isn't large enough to support a population of deer. I mean, look at my backyard and you can see that. I tell people that they're my gardeners. They trim my bushes, they fertilize my lawn, and they don't do either real good. It's just, you know. So what happens is that things like coyotes and deer, these larger animals, typically try to link together enough green space in various places so that they can live there. So coyotes, for instance, that live over in Reservoir Woods, for instance, they'll come over, run through our yard, and they'll hunt in Villa, for instance. So they've linked all those areas together, and that's kind of the way I am too. I link these areas together just like they do. So here's a photo from Villa Park. You know, again, there's a lot of habituated animals there. If you ever walk through the park, sometimes there's deer just standing right there, and I have photographed deer, like enormous bucks standing 30 feet from the path and people walking past them, not even seeing them. The deer just stand there. They're used to people. But here's the interesting thing about that is that deer, of course, will recognize each other. The bucks have got to be able to do that because if you're a medium-sized buck, you don't want to pick on a big buck during the rut. That's dangerous. You can get hurt. And so they certainly recognize each other as individuals. And I think they recognize us as individuals too. The work that I did at the Crane Foundation, the cranes would recognize us as individuals. They treat us differently. Yeah, they recognize us. And I ran an experiment with the deer in Villa Park one day. My wife rarely ever goes walking with me because I tend to stop too much. And she's out there for exercise, and we're not a good pair when it comes to hiking in Villa Park. But it was in the wintertime. There were about 6 deer ahead of us. She was accompanying me on this day, and there were about 6 deer up there laying there just off the path a little bit. And I said, Deb, I want to run an experiment. I said, let me walk past these deer and see what they do. And then I want you to walk past them, see what they do. So I walked past them. A couple of them stood up. The other 4 just laid there and watched me go. It's no big deal. I walked this path virtually every day that year at the same time, wearing basically the same colors of clothes and stuff like that. And so they seemed like they got familiar with me. I wasn't a threat. I got past them. The 2 deer were standing there, the 4 were laying there. Then I motioned for Deb to come. They all got up and walked away. I think they recognize us as individuals. So here's my backyard. I've speeded this up. Here's a coyote. My wife traps mice in the garage and throws them out here, and the coyotes come up and eat the mice. Lots of things going on in these parks, particularly at night and in our backyard. And there's our bushes being trimmed. Thanks, guys. Good job. More coyotes, another coyote, a red fox, another coyote, some more deer, and more deer. And the deer are kind of nice because what they do is they clean my lens. Yeah, they take ownership. Now take a look at this next little video. It happens pretty quickly, but there's another coyote in this, and it's got a tracking collar on it. You can see it kind of hanging down there. and it disappears, and then a second one shows up, and it cleans my lens. Yeah, that's really fun. Um, So, when we're out there doing this sort of photography, we can use the photography to help researchers figure out what's going on with different populations of animals. So things like iNaturalist, for instance, if some of you are familiar with that, you can upload your photographs with the location and that sort of thing. And it's and they have literally millions of records of hundreds or thousands of species around the world. And so we kind of get an idea of what the range is of certain animals and when they suddenly show up out of range and that sort of thing. Here in the Twin Cities, we've got the Twin Cities Coyote and Fox Project, which is being run by the University of Minnesota. So you can sign up, get an account, and another password, by the way, and and then you can log your sightings of gray fox, red fox, and coyotes. And it helps researchers figure out what's going on. And there's a lot of coyotes. I mean, probably all of you go out and walk in our parks, right? How many of you have had encounters with coyotes? Maybe about a third of you. Just now? Well, there we go. Oh, no, interrupt. The thing is that we probably have all had encounters with coyotes. If you're walking in the parks in the Roseville area, you probably have had encounters with coyotes known only to the coyotes. They're really good at staying hidden if they don't want to be seen. Sometimes they're brazen. I mean, I was sitting on a park bench once down in Villa, and coyote just walks past me on the bike path, just casual. I've ridden up behind him on my bike, and they're trotting down the bike path, and you have to slow down for them. And then suddenly they go, "Oh my gosh, there's some," and then they dash off. But you can report these things, and you can use photography to help researchers figure out what's going on. Are they dangerous? I like this bulletin. Don't call 911, according to the sheriff, unless, of course, you see them with a box labeled Acme or carrying an anvil around, then you want to, and then you want to call 911 because that's scary stuff, particularly if there's explosives involved. Uh, so I tend to photograph, everything from the tiniest little wasps that I can find to the biggest things I can find, like deer. And I really enjoy this. If we think about the animals that we see squirrels, rabbits, possums, raccoons, deer, fox, coyotes, those sorts of things. But if we look really carefully, the vast amount of diversity is that small stuff, the insects, for instance. And there's literally hundreds of species of insects, many of which have probably not been described by science yet in places like Villa and Reservoir Woods. And you get to see things shift. So some years, for instance, I see a lot of 4-spotted dragonflies, skimmers, and then some years there's more 12-spotted, and some years there's more blue dashers, and you see the cycling of the life. As an example of the diversity, we've got a little flower garden in our backyard. It's about 8 feet long by about 2 feet wide. So I just sat there one day and tried to figure out how many different things are using these flowers. There was this gold-spotted thread-waisted wasp. There was a cuckoo wasp, which are just absolutely gorgeous, little wasps. Candy-striped leafhoppers. And have you ever seen these guys? They're actually quite common. They're about a third of an inch long, and if you're more than 2 or 3 feet away from them, they blend in. They look kind of this grayish blue, and they blend into the vegetation. They like roses, which doesn't make them a favorite of people who grow roses, but they're absolutely spectacular if you crawl right up to them like this and photograph them using macro technology. What's this? Yeah, that's what everybody says. Yeah, mosquito. It's not. Mosquitoes are a member of the fly family. I mean, the fly family is just enormous. This is actually a species that doesn't have a common name. The genus is Geron, Geron, and it's a little pollinator, but it looks just like a mosquito. Anybody ever see one of these guys? I've seen 2 in my life. One was in South Dakota, and I just totally grossed me out when I first saw it because I thought it was a hornet with some sort of weird parasite emerging from its head. And I go, oh my gosh, that's terrible. That's horrible. But it's a brown mantid fly. The second one I've seen was in my backyard, in my patch. And it's the only time I've ever seen one in the 24 years that I have lived there in that house. So when you get used to working in a patch like this, you get to start seeing things that you've never seen before because given enough time, you can see a lot of things. Yeah. This is called a brown mantid fly. So it's called a mantid because it's got like those legs that a praying mantis has. And these are ambush hunters. So they'll sit on a leaf or a flower or something like that. And an insect will come into the flower like a bee or something like that. And it'll reach out and grab it like this and eat it. Really interesting, but really a bizarre looking animal. Have you seen these guys? These are actually pretty common, unlike the mantid fly. These are very common around here. This is an ambush bug. It is also a kind of a mantid type of predator. It's an ambush hunter. And you find them a lot of times on goldenrod in August and September. And they're ambush hunters, so they just sit there on the flower and an insect will come in and it'll grab the insect. In fact, they go after actually large, dangerous game, like bumblebees, for instance. And they must have some pretty powerful toxins because they'll grab the hold of the bee, they'll thrust a proboscis into them and then inject this toxin. It must kill them pretty quickly because, a bumblebee is a large, dangerous animal. And these bees don't struggle very long when they get hit by one of these ambush bugs. I had a naturalist friend up in northern Minnesota who was playing with one of these ambush bugs one day and it bit him. And he said it was really painful. So the toxins must be pretty potent, but they're pretty common. You have to look for them because they're well camouflaged, but you have almost certainly brushed up against them. And while they can bite, they don't see you as prey or anything like that. So they're not going to bother you unless you actually handle them or something like that. But a lot of things will bite you if you start handling them. Crab spiders. These are really cool spiders. Typically, I'm not real fond of spiders, except for jumping spiders. But crab spiders are okay. But they're also ambush hunters, and they can actually change colors. They're chameleons, so they can sit on a white petal and over a period of several hours, they will turn light colored. They can also change to yellow or a yellow green. Anybody ever see one of these? I don't see these very often. This is a wedge beetle. This is a male. They only live for a day after they come out of the ground. And so they got to find the females quickly if they're going to procreate. So they got these big kind of almost like deer antler type antennas to filter the pheromones out of the air. And sometimes you just find humorous things. Anybody know what this is? Close. It's a katydid nymph. Yeah, yeah. It's a katydid nymph. And these things are hilarious. They'll look at you and they'll do this. They'll have their legs like this and they'll go. And they'll just keep doing this. And they have such a goofy look on their face. I just have to laugh every time I see them. First time I saw it happening, I got to laughing so hard I couldn't take any pictures. And of course, bees, of course, really valuable pollinators. We have over 400 species of native bees in Minnesota. So very, very important. Anybody know what this is? Nobody? They're butterfly eggs. So here I'm sitting here by this little garden, taking pictures of the wasps and the wedge beetles and all this sort of stuff. And this butterfly comes flying in, and it was one of the ladies, painted lady, American lady, one of those. And it comes in and it lands on the leaf right beside me and starts laying eggs. And I'm going, wow, these things are just, from an engineering standpoint, I worked in engineering for 13 years, and this is amazing. Very cool. And they're about the size of pinheads, so they're really, really tiny. So I have to use specialized equipment to get in here and get these tiny subjects. These are longhorn bees. They're solitary bees, native bee. And at night, they don't go back to their burrows or their nests. They just find a twig someplace and they latch onto it with their jaws and they go to sleep. And what was really interesting here, this is in our pollinator garden, and there was this one sprig that kind of stood up above everything else. It's a bergamot stem, and it was sticking up about 6 inches higher than everything else. And the bees would be there every night that summer. And they don't gang together; they just happen to go to the same place to spend the night. And sometimes there'd be two, sometimes there'd be one, sometimes there'd be eight. And this is the only place that I found them in our yard, just on this one little sprig of bergamot. And they stay there all night. And I had so much fun photographing these guys. I took way too many photos. There are places within my patch that seems to attract a lot more wildlife than what maybe you'd think that it would. So this is a log in one of the ponds in Villa. It used to, when I first moved here, it was a tree that was standing, a big tree that was standing up, and it's tipped over. You know which one I'm talking about, don't you? It's tipped over, and in the spring of the year, the water's cold, but the sun is warm. And if you're a reptile like a turtle, you get up on that log. And that log is just covered with turtles in the early spring when the water's still cold. And they're trying to warm up. And of course, the egrets and the herons and stuff like that will use the log too to fish from. So in this particular instance, the turtles were completely covering the log. And this egret landed at the top of it and then just walked down the tops of the turtles. And I'm going, well, that's kind of cool. That's just really cool. Just interesting behavior. And the turtles were going, oh man, it's a big predator. But I got my shell. I just kind of tuck in and he just walked, and the egret just walked right down the tops of them. What's this bird? Does anybody know? Yeah, it's a green heron. So one of the interesting things about green herons is they're kind of brainy birds. And usually, early in the year in my patch, when I run across these birds, sometimes they can be a little standoffish, a little skittish. But towards the end of the season, there's been, 10,000 people have walked past them and nothing bad has happened. So, they get pretty used to people, they get more habituated. And and so this bird was kind of in this little thicket, standing on this log, preening. And so I kind of crept up to him and I sat down. I don't like to disturb my subjects. I like to catch them doing natural things. And so I'm just sitting there very patiently, and every once in a while somebody'd walk past and they'd stop and we'd talk a little bit. And because frankly, I'm getting bored. He's not doing much. He's just kind of standing there preening a little bit and snoozing. And then all at once he turns and he walks down the log, and I go, oh, he's gonna go fishing. This is gonna be good. He gets down, and just before he gets to this position, he suddenly does this. He tips his head away from me like this. He reaches out and plucks a spider out of a spider web. And you can see the spider right at the very end of his bill, maybe, just that little dark thing. And then there's kind of that, the legs are out there. And I thought, wow, that's kind of strange. He's going to eat a spider? I mean, that's a lot of work and effort for this large of a bird to eat a little tiny spider. Took another couple steps down the log, and he took that spider and he dropped it in the water. Yeah, he was using it for bait. And it struggled, in the water, doing the little dimpling things, and it floated over and it started to climb back up the log. And he picked it up, put it back out in the water again. And it wasn't in the right place, so he picked it up and moved it over a little bit. And bang. He got a fathead minnow out of his work. So you get to see some really fun stuff when you spend a lot of time in your patch. So lots of interesting behavior. Every once in a while I run across something I don't expect, like green herons fishing with bait. This happens to be a bee wolf. There's several different species of them in our area, and a lot of them will prey on bees, both native and honeybees. And but some of them prey strictly on flies. And so this one's captured a fly. It's stung it, it's paralyzed it, and now it's going to take it back to its nest, put it in there, lay an egg nearby, probably form off a cell, and when the egg hatches out, it's got a ready-made meal waiting for it. This is also really interesting. So we have this bumblebee here, but take a look at what's hanging on the tongue. It's a mite. And we've all heard of the varroa mite, that's attacking honeybee populations and stuff. This is something different. What we're seeing here is something that researchers call phoracy, P-H-O-R-S-E-Y. Phoracy is where one species takes advantage of another species, but doesn't really harm that species. So I was watching this bee, and it was kind of sitting there, kind of shaking its head back and forth, and I got to looking and taking some pictures, and here's that mite hanging onto the tongue of the bee. So these mites will hatch out on the heads of flowers, and then they wait for a bee to come by. And usually they latch onto a leg or a foot or onto an antenna. This is the first time I've ever seen one grab a tongue, which must have been a little disconcerting for the bee. Typically the bee kind of ignores them. What these mites do is they eat the detritus that's found in the nests of bumblebees. So what they want to do is they want to grab hold of the leg of a female bee and have the bee transport it back to the nest. It drops off in the nest and then feeds on little particles of pollen and maybe waste products and stuff like that. Doesn't bother the bees at all. In fact, it probably keeps things a little bit cleaner. But it has to get a ride back to the nest. So it latches onto the leg of a female bee and is carried back to the nest, and it just drops off. The interesting thing is they can tell the difference between a male and a female bee. If a male lands here, it'll latch onto it too. But then if that male bee tries to mate with a female, it'll drop off and grab a hold of the female, because the male doesn't go back to the nest. It needs a female to carry it back. So there's some sort of a mechanism there that they can tell the gender of the bee that lands near them. This is an example of kleptoparasitism. So we're all familiar with hummingbirds, and that our ruby-throated hummingbirds have to drink nectar. I mean, they're high energy birds. They need a lot of sugar, but they also need protein and stuff. So they will go out and they'll capture, small insects and that sort of thing. And typically what they'll do is they may fly out and hawk them. They'll fly out and grab them in midair and eat them. But a lot of times what they'll do is they'll fly up to a spider's web and pick little insects out of the spider web. It's called kleptoparasitism because they're taking food away from the spider. A few years ago, probably about 12 years ago or so now, maybe longer, I was out in the backyard and I found a stink bug, and I was photographing the stink bug, and I got back into the house and I'm trying to key it out, trying to figure out what it is. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't figure out what this thing was. I knew it was a stink bug, but I couldn't get it any closer to a species. So I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going, there's in Wisconsin, eastern Wisconsin, they've got a population of the brown marmorated stink bug. I wonder if that could be it, because that's a exotic invasive species that's really damaging. And so I thought, I'm going to look that up. And I looked that up and I go, oh, that's what I've got here. So I sent a picture off to arrest the pest with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And like 20 minutes later, they called me back up and said, where did you find this? So our yard was actually the second place that they had ever been found in our yard. It's a good example how photography can help researchers. And they immediately came out and put up this trap that's got a sticky plate on it. And those little black patches at the top were emitting pheromones that would attract the stink bugs. And the hummingbird was coming in and picking off the tiny insects off the sticky. So an example of parasitism, advantage of the researcher. There's that log again. So the quality of photographs are really important. So I spent a lot of time trying to really create really good photographs that can be used. I have approximately 4,000 photographs to the National Park Service. I have donated photographs to, I don't know, many different nonprofit conservation organizations, and they can use those in raising funds, for instance, or in educational materials. This is how I stay active in retirement. And so photos like this are really valuable for a lot of reasons. The other thing is that when you become really familiar with your with your area, with your patch, you get to know where to look for animals too. You know, a lot of space is kind of empty space. You got to go to the places where the deer bed down, for instance, if it's 11 in the morning. At 8 o'clock, you have to know where the feeding areas are, and you can maximize the amount of productivity that you get in your photography by knowing where to go. And of course, they're not always there, but you help to eliminate at least some of those issues. So there's a little patch of 3 pine trees in Villa Park where I find great horned owls on a fairly routine basis. They don't nest there. They nest elsewhere, but they use this area for hunting. So, and roosting during the day. And so I walked, every time I walk past those 3 little pine trees, I always, look up in the trees and walk around them and what's going on up there. And then, of course, there's the migratory birds. So you know that there's 3 different strategies for dealing with Minnesota weather, right? Winter weather. One's migration, just avoid it, out of there. And so you have to know when some of these species are going through. So I kind of have a pretty good idea when the ruby crowned kinglets are coming through, the golden crowned kinglets, when the white-throated sparrows are coming, and those sorts of things, and I can be in those areas where they're likely to be found because I'm familiar with the area. Another way that things avoid our winter is hibernation. And these animals that we call cold-blooded don't really hibernate. It's called brumation, but it's basically hibernation. What they do is with the wood frogs and tree frogs, a lot of them just crawl underneath the leaves and they freeze. And it's fascinating because they'll start to get hard when it gets cold. And when that happens, they start churning out, it depends on the species, but glycerol or glycerin or glycol, and they flood their bodies with it. The liver just starts producing this chemical. And that's kind of like an ant almost. The most important function of that is to drive water out of the cells. Because if ice forms inside the cells, they form in these little needle-like spicules, and they'll punch a hole in the cell membrane. If it gets driven in interstitial spaces between the cells, the spicules may penetrate the cell wall, but it doesn't penetrate the cell membrane, and the cell lives. So these guys will freeze up. 70% of their body will be as hard as a rock. Probably would make a good pet if you go to Florida in the winter, because you can just stick them in the freezer and they'll be waiting for you when you just don't want to drop them because they'll break. And of course, the other way is through just resistance. And this is the biggest way that species survive in Minnesota during the cold weather. So the deer will put on a layer of fat, for instance. Their hair will get longer and more numerous, and it'll get coarser, but it'll have these little wavy things at the base of each hair, and it traps air. The other thing that the ruminants, like the deer, have that we don't have is that they have the 4-chambered stomach. And they're using bacteria and protozoans to actually digest their food. And then they just get happy off the alcohol that's being produced. Okay. So what happens is that when you have that fermentation process going on in the stomach, it actually produces heat. They have little furnaces that we don't have, which is just fascinating, I think. One of the most fascinating things that I found in the woods is this little guy right here. Anybody know what this is? It's not a shrew. Interesting enough, we had a couple of shrews. We had a snow drift up against our patio door one winter, and the shrews were digging tunnels through it, and you could see them. It was like an ant farm, but with shrews. It was so cool. This is a vole, VOLE. These are the things, in the spring you'll see when the snow gets about 2 inches deep. You'll see these little gray trails. Yeah, that's what these things. Voles do not like each other. It's a wonder that they're even around, because they fight whenever they meet. They don't like each other. But their survival strategy for winter is completely different. What they do is that they don't gain a fat layer. They actually make their bodies smaller. Smaller animals require less food. But of course, that leaves them subject to cold if they get smaller. The smaller they are, the faster they'll cool off. So even though they really don't like each other in the winter, huddled together, and it reduces their loss of body heat by 15%, because they'll be like them all together in the subnivean zone between the ground and the snow. So fascinating little animals. Why this one was out running around on the top of the snow at this time of the year, I don't, because this was this was right at the prime breeding and nesting season for great horned owls, and so it was in trouble. So I have no idea why he was out on the surface of the snow.
Safe.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, not very good because they spend so much time underground and yeah. But yeah, it could tell that I was there because at one point it kind of turned and then turned and kind of scurried off. Or maybe he sensed me some other way. Sometimes I match a little bit. We probably all do this to some degree. We put up bird feeders, for instance, and I put up bee houses because I wanted to photograph bees. So I got photos like this, for instance, of this bee. I don't know what the species is. It's a leaf cutter of some sort, I think. And this bee was flying back in. You can see it's got a little bit of bee bread in its jaws. So this is pollen and saliva that they mix together. They fly back into this cavity that I created for them. They run all the way to the back. They drop off the bee bread, lay an egg, fly back out, grab a leaf or a dab of mud, and seal off a cell. And then they go out and they get more bee bread, and they just make that, and they fill up that entire cavity with with uh, with provisions. This would have been in, I think it was August, July or August. Yeah. Mhm. The bee houses also attract wasps. Wasps are hunters. They don't make bee bread. They provision their cells with caterpillars, and they fly in with a caterpillar and stuff it in the hole and lay an egg on it and then put in a dab of mud and seal it up and yeah. Caterpillars did not want to go into those holes. I don't blame them. And then with that, as soon as the bees and the wasps would leave, this wasp would move in. This is cuckoo wasp. It's a parasite on wasps, and it would lay its own egg in the nest of the bees and the other wasps. Sometimes I bring things into the house. Sometimes they get loose. I once found a tree frog on the wall of the dining room. I got it in this little terrarium before Deb came home. So I was glad, but I searched for it vigorously until I found it. Uh, we had this kind of this thing that, Deb kind of put her foot down on one occasion and said, no animals in the house. But I still kind of sneak them in now and then. So I got this little insect studio that I've put together down in the basement. And in this particular instance, I wanted to photograph things that live in the ponds at the bottom of the hill down in Villa Park. So I went down there and I scooped up some aquatic invertebrates and cleaned it up really good and took pictures of things like dragonfly larvae. This is a common green darner naiad, they're called, rather than nymph, but it's a nymph or a naiad. I ran a program. I had a BioBlitz with this aquarium, and the kids were just enamored with this. I had all sorts of things in there. At the end of and every once in a while, I hear the kids screaming, and it turned out that one of these big dragonfly had eaten something, and the kids would all scream, and they were fascinated by it, and then at the end of the day, there were just two common green darner dragonflies left in there. They'd eaten everything in that aquarium. And then I heard more screaming, and I went down there, and one was eating the other one. So, I mean, these, be glad you don't live back in the Triassic when these things were probably 18 inches long, be chewing off feet and toes, and you would not want to go into anything that had water. I can also remodel this into a terrestrial type of environment. Take pictures of jumping spiders. Typically, this is what I do in the wintertime a lot of times is I take pictures of things I find in my house. And if I find things in my house, they get photographed. This is anybody know what this is? It's a spider, obviously. This is a dark fishing spider. This is the biggest spider in Minnesota. We have them in Villa Park. They're not very common, but a female will be about 3.5 inches wide. And they're a hunting spider, so that means they're chasing things. They're very agile, they're very fast, and they have good eyesight out to about 3 or 4 feet. So this I did is I recreated an aquatic environment because that's where they live. They'll actually dive underwater and grab fish and stuff like that. Very interesting. One night I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Dad comes out of the bedroom. We're getting ready for bed, and she comes out of the bathroom and she goes, Gordon, she said, we've got ants. We got ants in the bathroom. And she looks at me and I look at her. And she looks at me and I look at her. And she says, do you want to photograph them or do you want me to kill them? I've got the best wife. I mean, my gosh, that's wonderful. The next morning I photographed the ants and then I got rid of them. Uh, of all of the spiders, these are the ones I really like because they actually act intelligent and inquisitive. I have been photographing these things at a distance of like 2 inches, and they will jump and land on the lens, and it looks like a charging grizzly bear when that happens. You know, startling, but they're just the coolest spiders. None of them get real big, you know, maybe a half-inch long, but a lot of them are a lot smaller than that. But I want to call your attention to the one in the lower right-hand corner. That's a jumping spider, called an ant-like jumping spider. And this particular species has only been found in Minnesota in just a couple of places. So again, I didn't know what I'd gotten when I took the pictures of it, and I kind of asked what it was, and I sent it off to iNaturalist and said, what is it? I said, I think this is what it is, and an expert came back and said, you're close. And then he gave me the description of it, and it's not a common spider in Minnesota. So that's kind of cool. I have no idea why I put this picture in here, but it's kind of nice. An action shot, I guess. I like to try to capture the personalities of things. And this deer photo really does it for me. I mean, you look into those eyes and the lighting is good. You know, it's a dramatic photograph. There's both cool colors of the background and the warm colors of the sunlight. It's just a photograph that you want to look at and say that's cool. I have printed some of my photographs as 40 by 60 inches, literally life size for deer, and they are amazing when they're blowing up that big. I had a exhibit down at McAllister College for a year. It was up for about 3 months, then COVID hit and they closed the building. So not everybody got to see it, but I had a whole bunch of pictures down in the Smale Gallery for a year, and one of them was of a deer laying there with those eyes. And it was really interesting. It was like the Mona Lisa of deer because you walk past it and the eyes would follow you. So I try to do these artistic things too, because it draws people in. And there's nothing better than getting all your ducks in a row, you know? And I also try to get low. In my photography, what I want to do is I want to pull people into the world of whatever it is that I'm taking a picture of. And I don't want to do it from a perspective of humans standing here looking down at things. And so I get down in the mud and I squirm on the grass and, and I get really dirty sometimes, but I get these photographs down in the world of whatever it is that I'm taking pictures of. By Bill Grebe, right? Yeah, okay, I'm cute, I think. Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to finish. I'd like you to take a look at this. Of course, we lost Carter here a few weeks ago, but I love this comment that he made at kind of the conclusion of his presidency. He says, in a few days, I'll lay down my official responsibilities in this office to take up once more the only title of democracy superior to that of president. And that's the title of citizen. As citizens, we have to be involved. We have to be involved in the political, we have to be involved in the social, the cultural, and we have to be involved in our natural environments as well. And so I kind of like to leave you with that idea of the responsibility of us. And I'm preaching to the choir. I know that because you guys are out there doing things, and I admire you for that. So I'll leave you with that. So unless you've got questions.